Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here as always.
Matt, it's great to see you on the yard in August. So tell us where you're at today.
Many times in the summer, because I live less than a mile from Harvard University, I wander down to the campus to absorb the great intellect and mooch off their free Wi-Fi, and that is where I am. I am right next to the Harvard Law School Student Center, where they will not let me in because I am not an alumni.
Well, Matt, we had a big announcement from the Department of Justice last week in the form of the DOJ announced its Whistleblower pilot program. You want to go through some of the highlights that you saw in at least the initial announcement?
Well, it was interesting to see it, and I suppose there are two ways to look at this, from the whistleblower's perspective or the corporate compliance officer's perspective, and there's news in there for both groups. For would-be whistleblowers, basically, the Justice Department has set up a whistleblower awards program, much like the other tipster programs we have seen at the IRS, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other agencies throughout the federal government, where if you bring a tip to the criminal division about corporate misconduct of some kind, and that tip leads to some sort of monetary settlement with the company, then you, the tipster, can win up to 30% of the net proceeds of that settlement, which means if, for example, there's a $300 million settlement, but $100 million of that goes to restitution for victims of this misconduct, then you would win 30% of the remaining $200 million. But nonetheless, this program is up and running. It has a nifty website where tipsters can submit their reports. The Justice Department did say it had a few different ideas of the types of crimes it was really hoping to get information on. For example, the FCPA, the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. There, I knew I had it in my brain somewhere, which is the law enacted late last year to criminalize foreign government officials receiving bribes. So you could wind up, if you have knowledge about a corrupted government official overseas who's taking bribes, you could report him or her to the Justice Department for a FCPA violation. They are looking at FCPA prosecutions for non-public companies, because if you are a public company with an FCPA issue, you're most likely going to have a settlement also involving the Securities and Exchange Commission, which does have a whistleblower program. But if you are a private company not on the SEC's radar, then there isn't any awards program for that. Various types of healthcare fraud as well, things like that. But the basics, the goal here from the Justice Department is to make sure that if you are aware of corporate crime, there is some sort of incentive program out there if you, the whistleblower, want to go to report it to the department. There's no more cracks in, there is a potential crime that you might want to report about, but there's no awards program out there for that crime. They want to seal that up. Tom, for compliance officers in compliance programs generally, and general counsels, this does set up an interesting tension, is that if the whistleblower now has more incentive to go take his or her concern directly to the Justice Department, well, if they do that, then in theory, you, the company, would lose the potential for any voluntary self-disclosure credit if you decide to bring your misconduct to the department. So this could lead to an incentive for companies not to self-report. Now, the Justice Department was aware of that tension, and so they have addressed it. And this is the part that's interesting for compliance officers now, is that they have tweaked their voluntary self-disclosure policies, that if you receive an internal report from a whistleblower who then takes that concern to the department anyways, if you, company, then still bring that report to the department in voluntary self-disclosure within 120 days, and the department has not yet called you up to ask, what's going on? We have this whistleblower who's telling us things. If all of that lines up, then you could still be eligible for the voluntary self-disclosure credit, even though the whistleblower has already brought that matter to the regulator's attention. And I think that is a big deal.
Matt, I certainly agree with that point, that it is a big deal. It really drives home for me 2 points I wanted to visit with you about. I believe this is going to put even more pressure on compliance programs, on HR, on whistleblower hotlines, on Speak Up to get the information in, triage it, get the investigation done, and make a decision very, very quickly. The second question I have is, how does the DOJ envision a whistleblower would be rewarded if a company receives a declination? Would it be a part of the um, not restitution, but the remediation pay back to the government or ill-gotten gains in terms of profit disgorgement?
Tom, I have to admit, that is an excellent question that I had not yet had time to research. The way that they framed it in the snazzy press release and the big speech and all of that was that the whistleblower, would receive up to 30% of the net proceeds after asset forfeiture. And I don't necessarily know exactly what that encompasses. They specifically did give an example of restitution to victims and other assets that might be forfeited. I I'm making this up off the top of my head, but for example, if the Justice Department winds up seizing a certain number of illicit goods and then has to sell them and liquidate them somehow, I guess that would count as proceeds and forfeited assets. But to your specific point, if there's a non-prosecution agreement, then you win a percentage of what exactly? And I don't know. We'll have to look into that unless you happen to know the answer. But I think that's another interesting dynamic.
No, I don't have the answer to that because I'm not sure if profit disgorgement is kind of classified as payment or a fine or penalty. I don't think it is. And so I wonder, just in my mind, that that's an open question at this point. But maybe go back to the first point. How do you see the pressure now on internal compliance programs to get it right?
Well, I definitely think that there are two big points here. First, you really do need to make sure that you have a good, tender, loving care and nurturing of internal whistleblowers so that they still are incentivized through the love of their hearts and they want the company to do the right thing, that they report to you first. Because all of your ability to address this in a way that you would like depends on you knowing what is going on. And if the whistleblower hasn't brought anything to your attention, you don't know what's going on. So, what is the tender love and care that you will show whistleblowers? How much are you investing in anti-retaliation training for managers and coworkers? How much are you just communicating to employees generally that whistleblowing is a good thing and we want those internal reports? Everything else you might want to do flows from that you have the internal report so you at least can start making decisions. Second big point, however, would be when you actually have a report that might plausibly be worth voluntary self-disclosure, what is the company's process to be able to work through that decision? Um, Clearly, there are going to be several parties involved in thinking that through. The general counsel will be one, outside counsel will be one, probably the CEO. If it is a significant enough issue, I could certainly see it going all the way up to the board. But I would then ask, will the chief compliance officer also be involved in those conversations? And have you defined a formal process for it? I was on a webinar just the other week where this subject about the department's award program came up. And so I asked everybody listening, several hundred, how many of you have an actual defined process right now to decide whether to self-report? And I would say a majority of those listeners, several hundred, said, yes, we do have one, but it wasn't a big majority. A lot of people said, no, our company doesn't really have a defined process yet. And I think there would be a lot of risk in that, because if you mishandle it or you're inconsistent from one issue to the next, then who knows how the whistleblowers might respond to that? Who knows what future whistleblowers who have not yet blown the whistle on what they know, they see the company mishandle something else, like, I don't want to be following that guy, so I'm just going to go straight to the Justice Department. You have to think about that sort of dynamic as well, because the real problem here could be what happens when the whistleblower goes to the Justice Department, spills the beans, and then you, company, go to the department later on to voluntarily self-disclose. You don't know the whistleblower's gone. You don't know what they might have said. And are you really going to be able to make good decisions about what you want to disclose with that variable out there? And I'll stop there for a moment, but we have a very specific example of how that could go wrong from the Securities and Exchange Commission and a whistleblower award they gave out about 2 weeks ago, where this pretty much was the scenario that happened. The company did not have a good time with that.
So, do you think this changes? And I want to get to that SEC case in a minute, but before that, do you think this changes the whistleblowers' internal calculus of somewhere between 85 and 90% of whistleblowers who've gone to the SEC have reported internally first?
I mean, I would like to think that it's not going to change their incentives or their calculus that much. Other evidence and surveys and research I have seen before shows that a solid majority of employees do want to report internally because they want to see the right thing done and they want their company to do well. And I've always said that is great raw material for an ethics and compliance program to work with. It's just, are you working with that in the right way? Really, because all of these people who want to report, also a fair number of them don't. Well, why not? Fear that nothing will get done. Fear I'll suffer retaliation. So it gets back to anti-retaliation protections and communicating with the whistleblower to show them that not just they can speak up, but that they're being heard and management is listening to them, and management somehow conveying back to them, yes, you filed this report. Here's how we've heard it. We're listening. We're trying to think of what to do. Could even say something like, we did look into it. We can't tell you, employee, how it's been resolved, but it's been resolved. Like, there are all sorts of questions like that, that it drives up the importance of management listen up culture as much as it does whistleblower speak up culture. Whistleblowers want to speak. If they don't speak up, they will speak sideways to their colleagues or they'll speak out to the regulators. Neither of those things are as good as speaking up to management.
So let's go to the SEC case. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how the company either fumbled it or engaged in missteps, and how you see that really impacting how we should think through the DOJ program on this issue?
This case was fascinating. And yes, as with all SEC whistleblower awards, I can only tell you a little about the case because we know that the award was for $37 million, but we don't know what was the company involved, what was the misconduct involved, when did this actually happen. The SEC never discloses those details. But what we do know from what the SEC said is that the whistleblower in question did report internally first. And in fact, more than that, the whistleblower, quote, persistently, unquote, reported the matter. And then eventually decided that they weren't being heard, I guess, because they then took their tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission. At some point after that, I think, we're not entirely sure on the timeline, the company did decide, okay, let's investigate this matter. They investigated, and the company said, okay, we should go self-disclose this to the SEC. But the SEC already had the whistleblower in hand. The whistleblower had already tipped them off, and the whistleblower was already cooperating. And then the company showed up and started talking, except that the SEC's opinion, the company was not that forthcoming. And let me see if I have the direct quote here. Without the whistleblower's ongoing, extensive, and timely assistance, the staff would not have learned the full context and extent of the employer's misconduct. And the employer was talking to them. And still, they had all these issues that only the whistleblower could illuminate for them. And I think that shows just the sort of tension we had talked about with the Justice Department. The whistleblower was there. They tried to do the right thing. Then they persistently tried to do the right thing. For whatever reason, they did not feel heard, went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then the company said, okay, this is serious. We're going to have to voluntarily self-disclose. But it looks like they were not as forthcoming or as cooperative or as eager-beager to solve this misconduct as the SEC would have liked. And the SEC knew all this because they had the whistleblower. And the company would have had to know the SEC had the whistleblower too, because he had reported persistently first. And yet they wound up with this incomplete or inadequate sort of discussion when they finally got around to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I don't know the full details of that, Tom, but let's just remember that if an SEC whistleblower award is 10 to 30% of the settlement, and we're talking about a $37 million reward, that implies a monetary penalty of 150 up to 350, $370 million. This was a big deal. I can't see how something that big would not have gone up to the board at some point. We don't know if it's an FCPA case or an accounting fraud case or some sort of market manipulation scheme, but it was something big. How did the company have something that big where they knew there was a whistleblower? Maybe he or she would go to the SEC, but let's go to the SEC anyways, now that we've finally investigated. But we're going to give an inadequate disclosure of this when they know that the whistleblower may have already tipped off the SEC? Like, how does that work? What was the company thinking? And I don't know. I wish we had more details, but it is a fascinating cautionary tale about how not to handle this.
Matt, any real criticisms you've heard, or at least critiques of this, such as the tripartite scheme for percentages payable to whistleblowers?
I haven't really heard anything from it yet. I mean, clearly, whistleblower lawyers think this is great because it is yet another avenue for them. Frankly, I think a lot of compliance officers in a roundabout way should be appreciative of this because it makes the importance of the whistleblower hotline go up. And so you, in charge of the whistleblower hotline, become a more important player in these conversations. I think it is good that the Justice Department is trying to seal up all possible misconduct scenarios where there isn't a whistleblower awards program, because without it, a whistleblower really is only going to the regulator out of the just goodness of their own heart, and there's still an awful lot of risk for whistleblowers. This will be an arduous, long, drawn-out process at the best of times, and probably at the end of it, you're not going to get any money. You're probably not going to get $37 million. And, I have seen people who've gone the whistleblower route, and their career goes into the ditch, and 6 years later, they get like 800 grand. 800 grand more than you had before, but if you're in your mid 40s or 50s and your career has now stalled, 800 grand is not necessarily a lot of money to take you into your retirement and your golden years. This is a high risk thing people do. So the more we can help give them protections and the more that can drill into companies, you have to take this seriously. I personally think that is a good thing.
Well, Matt, I think this program is scheduled to last for 3 years, if I read that correctly.
That is,
so
yes.
We may have some time. And I think there were some critiques, if not criticisms, of the tripartite scheme for percentage payments. For whistleblowers, it's 30% of the first 100 million, 5% of any amount between 100 and 500 million. Not clear what would go above 500 million. But the other thing, the department said that this is a pilot program, and that they will take not simply commentary, or not simply assess the results, but they'll take commentary from the compliance community. And I guess I'd like to end by asking this, Matt. You and I, talk about compliance all the time. We obviously talk to a lot of people in the compliance field. Everyone in the compliance field I know of is pro whistleblower, pro speak up. Do you think this message will get to senior management or those who don't think having a speak up is worthwhile?
That's a good question, because at this point, I would like to think those executives who still don't see the sense in the speak up culture are A, so few, but which would be the good part, but B, they're kind of, I don't know, maybe beyond redemption at this point. We have been talking about the importance of the speak up culture for the better part of, 15 or 20 years. And really, A CEO who is opposed to speak up culture is somebody saying, I don't want to hear that things are going wrong. Um, Most CEOs I know would be eager to hear something is not going wrong, because that is then reason for them to reach in and fix it to make sure it's going right. Those few people, especially at the senior management levels, who still think a speak up culture is bad, I, I don't know what to tell them anymore. I mean, go get your head examined. Go read the data. Go look at my newsletter or listen to this podcast. The more mid-level or lower-level people who are afraid of misconduct happening under their watch and they want to sweep it under the rug, I I still don't condone that attitude, but I do think that I can see why people further down the org chart might have a slightly different view than senior management. But it's just going to be something that compliance officers would have to grapple with. Um, we'll see how it works.
Well, Matt, that seems like a good place for us to end this episode. I can't wait to see what next week brings us.
Thank you very much, Tom.